right? Thanking and praising God for his presence, understanding the way that in the last chapter, we saw the way that our work can be super frustrating without his help. And for that reason, and for that reason, let's call Haggai chapter 2 with you, because God is going to promise to be with his people now that they have refocused away from their personal interest into a broader set of priorities. Understanding that, I'm going to try to generally summarize this chapter for clarity and because I'm not super familiar with the book of Haggai, and to give you at least a contrast, understanding that if I overdid it and made chapter 1 a little bit confusing, I'm going to try to correct that by not trying to do too much in a situation where I don't know a whole lot. So let's just keep it brief, seeing that there seem to be 3 clear sections in chapter 2. 1, talking about the way that the latter glory of the house of the Lord will be greater than whatever it is they see before them right now, no matter how discouraging it might be to see what they have in comparison to what it might have been before. Going on, though, that second section going from verses 10 on through verse 19, that section is going to seem to talk about another perspective on their failures to this point, understanding that God said that their personal failures in chapter 1 were no coincidence. He was involved in it. Likewise, this time he is going to give them an illustration from the law. If you take holy meat and put it into a garment, does that make the things that the garment touches holy? To which they're going to respond, no, it doesn't make the things that the garment touches holy, even if they have touched holy meat. However, if a person becomes defiled by touching a dead body, do the things that they touch then become defiled? At which point the priest is going to say they indeed do become defiled. God then will step in and give them the application, another perspective on the way that everything they put their hands to really turn to naught, because it's literally going to say what they offer there is unclean in verse 14, quite possibly meaning the absence of a properly built temple and an altar to provide the sacrifices of atonement for their sins, render the sacrifices or anything they actually tried to offer in the way of a sacrifice literally unclean. But it could more generally or maybe figuratively refer to the fact that their priorities had shifted to building up their own personal stuff, as we saw in chapter 1, at the expense of neglecting the higher priorities that was moving forward, the things that God had told them to prioritize. Understanding that either way, they were in a season of failure because God not only was not with them, as we saw in the first chapter, he had actually caused the frustration that they saw in their own personal efforts to simply fixate on their own personal interests, specifically in verse 15, calling their attention back to the time before stone was placed upon stone, how they fared in verse 16. All of the expectations they had of progress simply being frustrated by reality. Verse 17 saying, even still, they did not turn back to God. Verse 18 marking the transition, though, where he is going to once again say, consider from this day onward. They still, even though they have repented, they still haven't really come into a season where their efforts are actually producing what they seem like they really should be producing. Then he is going to say, or at the end of verse 19, he's going to say, however, but from this day on, I will bless you. In the last section, verses 20 through 23, he is then going to turn his attention toward the nations and more specifically toward Zerubbabel, their governor, as he is going to say, don't worry, it's not just you. He is about to frustrate the power of the nations as he brings the kingdoms to nothing, but he will be with Zerubbabel, describing his plans for Zerubbabel this way in the last verse of the chapter, verse 23, reading, on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts. Ending the entire chapter with the encouragement that Zerubbabel will have the blessing of the Lord's presence over his work. Understanding the way that he even subdues the nation is using one of God's familiar tools for disciplining the nations. When he, in times where his people are simply outnumbered or overmatched, he simply turns the sword of the enemy or the swords of the enemy's people against one another, shifting from becoming the enemy of his people who had become fixated on their own self-interest to once again becoming their advocate, understanding that in section 2, he shifted from the days where he frustrated their labor to the days where he was now going to bless their works or their efforts. Going back to section 1, where he is literally going to encourage them, as our title suggests, in verse 4, work, for I am with you. Verse 5 saying, my spirit remains in your midst. A super encouraging conclusion to the book of Haggai, but one that also reminds me of the tragedy in Jesus's day, as in his own ministry, at least as his earthly ministry is winding down and he is preparing to go to the cross. Matthew chapter 23, beginning about verse 37, is going to record his lament over Jerusalem, famously reading, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Lamenting the fact that once again, even though he reestablished his remnant in his nation, they still went back to that same 360-degree turn that put them back into the place where God was going to leave them desolate. Quite possibly reminding me why we recently prayed, as we frequently start our prayer. My prayer for you is my prayer for me. But in a recent video, we asked God, please help to give us a commitment to make changes that are as steadfast as your love for us.